So what is a supply chain? Well, let's look at some examples. You can think of a supply chain as being any two parties or more that are linked by a flow of resources. And so the key word here is flow. The idea of supply chains is managing flows. And flows of what? Flows of product or material, flows of information, and flows of money. And all of these things, all of these three flows, manage between the multiple parties and ultimately fulfill a customer request. So let's look here. If I have this simple example where I have a retailer over here on the right, and I've got some kind of manufacturer of something on the left, and I've got a customer comes in. You can see this little shopping cart. So what's going to happen? Well, what's the idea of what the store will do? Well, at some point, the store is going to have to place an order or send some information over to its supplier. At some point, the supplier is going to send material in the form of a delivery back to the store. So the physical flow moves. Then eventually, hopefully sooner than later for the supplier, the retailer will send money or payment or financial terms to the supplier. But also during this transaction, throughout the physical delivery and the time between the order being placed and fulfilled, there'll be other information that's going back and forth for status. And so you can see these three major flows, information, material, and money, will always go back and forth between the different parties in a supply chain. And what supply chain management is all about is managing those three flows. How do you manage those three flows to minimize cost, maximize profit, improve level of service to customers, and all those other metrics that we'll talk about in a little while. But it's not just this simple little link. This is the link in the whole supply chain, the simplest piece of a supply chain. Because you can think of a supply chain as a series of these going all the way from this retailer where the customer comes in to the farm. You might have a distribution center here, one manufacturing plant here, a raw processing plant here, but it all goes back to this farm or some raw material. And it's even more complicated than that. This is a serial supply chain where everything is one to the next, because in real life it looks something like this, where I have multiple retailers, so I have these distribution centers are servicing multiple locations. I might have these raw material providers. This farm might ship directly to the store. Right? So they might have a direct link beyond these echelons and skip a bunch of these intermediate players and go straight to the final customer. You might have here's a farm here that's providing two different manufacturers raw product. And so there's all these different flows between different companies, between different levels in the supply chain. So it's not just a simple link one to the other. It's more of a web. But the common phrase is supply chain. Another way to look at this is, let's think about a bicycle manufacturer. So if I'm manufacturing bicycles, I probably don't make everything myself. I probably have some supplier that, say, gives me hardware, the gears, the wheels, all the different pieces that go on top of stuff, and then the frame itself, the metal frame that everything sits upon. And so each one of those vendors probably also have vendors, because whoever makes the hardware probably doesn't make the tires themselves. They might get that from a third party. They might have a manufacturer who specializes in gears, someone who specializes in pedals, and so forth. And the same thing for the frame supplier. They probably don't cast their own aluminum frames. They probably take that and then maybe mold them. Same thing with the paint. They must get the paint from a third party. And we can go even further down to the inputs to each of those. So if I'm thinking of the bicycle manufacturer, if I'm sitting here, then these people would be my first tier of suppliers. This would be the second tier, and here is the third tier. So when people talk about my first tier suppliers, those are the companies that I do business with directly. But when I talk about my third tier customers, if I'm here at this bicycle manufacturer, that's someone that I don't even talk to directly. And so this is an interesting point that we'll come back upon later, because there's a lot of risk here. Because what goes into the products down here eventually will end up in my product. But I don't talk to them directly. I talk to the people who talk to the people who talk to them. So this N tier or third tier manufacturer supplier problem is something we'll talk about a little later. But this is only half the supply chain, because now I've made my bicycle, I've got to sell it somewhere. And you have the same type of tiered structure. I might sell to wholesalers, who then in turn sell to retailers, who in turn sell to customers. And there might be other intermediary ones in there. In fact, lately, there might be something where I sell directly to a retailer, like an online retailer, and they sell directly to the customer. There's no wholesaler involved. And even more, that might be that I have my own website, for example, and people can buy directly from me. So there's a lot of flux in how things are changing. But the idea of a supply chain, the concept hasn't changed too much. When people talk about a downstream supply chain, what they're talking about is the direction that the product flows. So customers are downstream. So when anyone talks about moving closer downstream, they're moving closer to the customers. Think of it as a river. And when people say upstream, I'm worried about my upstream logistics, they're talking about closer to your supplier's supplier's supplier. So the idea of downstream and upstream and tiers of suppliers is common in all supply chains. So one last comment, the whole idea of a supply chain. Think about all these links that we have going on, but the primary purpose of a supply chain is only to satisfy some customer's needs somewhere. There's only one source of revenue in the supply chain, and that's at the very end. Some customer buys it. And all the payments between the different parties are just fund exchanges. And so the division of this intra-supply chain payments are really a function of power, market conditions, and a bunch of other factors. But it's very helpful to think about the supply chain as one entity that's providing value to that customer, because we try to think about the supply chains as maximizing the total value generated. So it's what the customer pays minus the total effort it takes to fulfill that order. Now, this is a gross simplification, but thinking about it in this way makes things a lot easier when you look longer term and look at the total landed cost and the effect of working together as a supply chain that crosses multiple firms.